Hello and welcome to another Frontline recap. We'll be looking at the major events in the week around Russia and the war in Ukraine and discussing some of the Times Radio experts analysis that we've seen coming through this week. So what's been going on in Ukraine this week? Well, tactically nothing dramatic has changed. The Ukrainians have started a counter-offensive again in Kursk and captured some more territory. The Russians are worried about that. They're moving troops from the Donbass up to try and deal with it. But not much else has changed on the front line. Ukraine still continues to attack Russian critical national infrastructure and oil refineries. But the big thing that's hit us this week is the Ukraine Contact Group, where the new US Secretary of State for Defense, Pete Hegseth, has made a statement outlining the US's position on a number of different things when it goes forward. The first one that struck me was his comments on Ukraine joining NATO.
The United States does not believe that NATO membership for Ukraine is a realistic outcome of a negotiated settlement. Instead, any security guarantee must be backed by capable European and non-European troops. If these troops are deployed as peacekeepers to Ukraine at any point, they should be deployed as part of a non-NATO mission, and they should not be covered under Article 5. There also must be robust international oversight of the line of contact. To be clear, as part of any security guarantee, there will not be U.S. troops deployed to Ukraine.
And Pete Hegseth, in looking at who should be responsible for taking on security guarantees inside Ukraine, is pushing a non-US involvement comment, and he is quite clear in what he says. And of course, underpinning all of this, his comments on the ability for Ukraine to get its territory back are quite clear.
We want, like you, a sovereign and prosperous Ukraine. But we must start by recognizing that returning to Ukraine's pre-2014 borders is an unrealistic objective. Chasing this illusionary goal will only prolong the war and cause more suffering. A durable peace for Ukraine must include robust security guarantees to ensure that the war will not begin again. This must not be Minsk 3.0.
Now, a number of fantastic videos. The first one I want to mention is from Malcolm Nance, who's a former US naval intelligence officer, and he fought in Ukraine. And he's been discussing the morale amongst Ukrainian soldiers, and that the Ukrainians might not stop fighting even if Trump and Putin go over their heads.
Anything's possible, but I'm going to give you a hard reality check. I still maintain my contacts with my battalion. I fundraise for them. I bury my friends. We pay for all the burials. My friends are still on the line. I'm always tempted every day to go back and re-enlist and help there. One thing I learned while I was in these destroyed villages in Kharkiv province on the zero line is that you cannot beat the Ukrainians for heart. They are not going to surrender Crimea. They are not going to surrender Zaporizhia, half of Kherson, allow Donetsk and Luhansk to remain in Russia's hands just so the shooting stops. These are people who have been brought up to blood. And Russia has done this to them. They have killed their women and children. They're killing their soldiers. Men and women in the Ukrainian armed forces die every day. And they are not going to accept any terms that appear surrender. This proposal that some have put forward as a peace plan to freeze the battlefront, right where it is along this line, create a demilitarized zone. No one's accepting that. No one. I certainly wouldn't. I've lost numerous friends in the International Legion who went there to help Ukraine defeat Russia, not come to a stalemate that surrenders to Russia. Very early on in the war, the one thing that you saw around Ukraine more than anything was a stencil of a Cossack's head. And for a long time, I didn't understand what the Ukrainian below it was until I started learning to speak Ukrainian. And it said, "We will not die as slaves." That phrase of being a slave is very, very powerful within their culture. These men in the Ukrainian army, these men and women, there are a lot of women in the army, these are Cossacks. You are not going to beat these people on the battlefield. They will throw rocks at you if they have to. But now, could something happen that forces Russia to withdraw to maybe closer to the 1991 lines? Who knows? The battlefront could break at any time. Ukraine could find themselves on the blitz. I'm a big believer that they have that capacity. They have enough combat throw weight. They have enough weapon systems from the West that Russia could just crack. Their line is a very fragile, tenuous, a fragile, tenuous position that is built on an offensive that will never succeed. It will never succeed. So I think that this war is going to continue. I don't think that there will be a peace treaty along the lines just for the sake of stopping the fighting so Donald Trump can, fulfill some fantasy of being the new Teddy Roosevelt and Jimmy Carter, who really, he has it in his head. I've heard from people who know him personally. The Nobel Peace Prize is the thing that he wants more than anything since Barack Obama got one. This war is not going to be fought so that his ego can be massaged at that level. I know we've spilled, when I say we, the royal we, as a former member of the Ukrainian army, too much blood has been spilled to surrender and to come up with a settlement that would look like they gave their country away. Not going to happen.
Now, Malcolm is a huge Ukrainian fan, and he's actually been on the front lines, and he says that the spirit of the Ukrainian troops that are there is the Cossack spirit he brings out in his phraseology, and says that their morale is high, their equipment is good, they're in a position where they know that they're fighting for the survival of their country and the survival of their families. And he says that they will not want to give up any territory or any concessions whatsoever, no matter what international geopolitics is trying to say. That in itself is going to give Zelensky a challenge if he's having to rein his troops back in again. It's a command issue that's in the military. But Malcolm, I agree with you. The Ukrainian troops are amongst some of the best operational experienced troops that we've got in Europe. They are well trained, their equipment is good, but they're tired. They're very tired indeed. So it'll be interesting to see what happens whenever we get into the peace negotiations that are happening. Next video is from the Times' Maxim Tucker, and he's discussing the importance of Kursk, both from an operational perspective, and he talks of the Russians having to put more focus on Kursk because the Ukrainians, they haven't been able to displace the Ukrainians from there, and how Kursk is now sucking troops from the tactical fight in the east to try and deal with it. But he talks about the tactics that there are in Kursk and says that it's much more of a fluid maneuver operation rather than it being static defensive lines and attack from that or defend from those positions. And that's much more challenging for both sides, but in particular the Russians, because the Ukrainians have got the equipment, the wherewithal, the training to carry out maneuver operations. And he says when it comes to negotiations, the Ukrainian retention of elements of Kursk will be vital from a Zelensky perspective, and it's something that Putin doesn't want. He does not want Ukrainian boots on any bit of Russian territory. So he says there's a lot more to come out from what is happening in Kursk.
And this is something you'll hear again and again. When the Ukrainians, they enjoy a piece of kit that they have, and they're using it. They showed that they can use it to great effect. They can be trusted to use these machines, and why doesn't the West send them more? And what's the West expecting to do with them? And one of the questions I think for all Western governments in the scenarios, the pace of this war is progressing so quickly. We're already seeing, we discussed last time, land robots on the battlefield. That is, autonomous kind of vehicles are going to be the future of this warfare. And so like having a big tank like the Challenger in 5-10 years, that kind of vehicle is out of date. Why not give it to the Ukrainians now and use it to hurt the Russians while it still can?
Maxim, last week we marked the 6-month anniversary, 6 months since the start of the Kursk offensive. What did you learn about how important that's proving to hold every inch of ground, specifically at this moment?
So the Ukrainians, we've also been in the Donbass last week, and the Ukrainians there now say we are beginning to feel the difference. Like a significant amount of troops have been redirected to the Kursk operation to try and drive the Ukrainians out of Russia. So those troops in the Donbass are starting to feel that there is not such an intense amount of pressure. Obviously, the fighting is still significant there, but it's having an effect. It's dynamic. The warfare there, actually, the soldiers said, is very different. There's a lot more maneuver warfare. There's a lot more tanks and armored vehicles. It's less infantry dug into positions, and it's more the onus is on the Russians to really drive the Ukrainians out. And Putin is so desperate to get the Ukrainians out of Kursk that he is sacrificing an awful lot of men in kind of attacks that are unlikely to be successful. So the Ukrainians say they are destroying an incredible amount of manpower and equipment. They talked about wiping out half of the North Korean force that had been sent to Kursk, about 5,000 men, and that's a really significant amount in about a month of fighting.
And also particularly important, given that President Zelensky also entertained the idea of exchanging land in Kursk for the return of Russian-occupied territory in any peace deal.
Right. I mean, that's something the Russians have ruled out. They said that we will not exchange any part of land. And again, that speaks to kind of Putin's determination to get just see peace on his terms. He's not going to negotiate, I don't think, significantly, meaningfully. But that's something that Ukrainians have been holding on to. They want Kursk to be part of any peace negotiation. They know that if they can hold it, that is a bargaining chip for them in an otherwise not very strong hand. And they can see that Putin is really struggling to get them out. And it's also, very much undermines his regime that he can't guarantee the security of Russia's borders. That's a big problem for him domestically and internally.
Our next video is from Diane Francis, who's the editor-in-large at the National Post, and she's discussing the threat to Putin's regime from the ongoing Ukrainian assassination campaign. But she's also talking more about Putin's position when it comes to any negotiations after we saw the US President and then his Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth outline the US position at the recent Ukrainian contact group meeting. And she comes up with some very, very interesting analysis, and I think hits the nail on the head, and talks about the resource deal that the United States is doing with the Ukrainians over access to rare earth metals not going away, and therefore the US is going to continue to supply capability to the Ukrainians based on that deal. Therefore, it is all not gloom and doom. She was asked a particularly important question, I think, and it was, will Putin sign up to any compromises and deals? And her comment back was, I think he'd better be prepared to sign up to them, and suggested that Donald Trump would not react well to Putin trying to entrench himself and dig into not giving any concessions for the negotiations that are going on. So her video, I urge you to watch. Everything in it I agree with extremely well. She's got her analysis spot on.
The only difficulty he faces is the Grim Reaper. He either dies or he's offed. And this is a complete dictatorship. This is an old-fashioned czar, and he's untouchable. He's got everybody under his control. He's got enough money. As long as he has enough money for his secret police and his gulags and his military, he's okay. Now, once something happens to him, or he may decide to step down. I don't see that in the cards. But once he is removed from the equation, then all bets are off. And I think you see, and I've written about this many times, you'll see the division into many, many different independent countries of the Russian Federation, because it's not a Russian Federation. It's a federation run by Russians, white Slavic Russians in St. Petersburg and Moscow, but the rest of it are a bunch of ethnic groups that have been enslaved to them. So that will all spin off. And that is a very good thing as long as the nuclear arsenal is somehow protected from someone.
So you think Vladimir Putin is as secure in his post as he's ever been?
Yes, unfortunately.
And there's no chance of, because people didn't see necessarily Prigozhin and his attempted mutiny coming, there's no chance of something equivalent happening at some point in the next couple of years?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. I said he could be killed. He could be killed. Somebody could, in his inner circle, could do it. Or, Ukraine gets lucky with a drone. Lord knows they'd like to do that, because that changes everything.
So given what we've been hearing from Pete Hegseth today, given the general mood music that America is not prepared to fund Europe's defence in the way that it previously has, what more specifically would you like to see from the likes of the UK, France and Germany? Yes, of course, increasing defence budgets is part of it. But what else? Is there more military aid they could be providing to Ukraine right now ahead of peace talks to strengthen their hands? Or is there something else you'd like to see happen?
Well, the Americans are not backing off military aid. Remember that. The resource deal is actually the opposite. They get that resource deal signed and sealed, and it looks like it might be in the next week. You could see a flood of weapons. The other things the Americans what the Europeans could do is they could seize all those central bank Russian assets and give it to Ukraine for military and humanitarian aid. Just gift it. As well as put together an expeditionary force comprised of proportionately all of the NATO countries, or the European countries, and all of the EU countries, I would say, not all of whom are in NATO, led by, I would say, Britain and Poland, who are the moral forces, and Macron, if he retains power, who's a good guy. And you get those three, and they'll push the others in the right direction.
I just wonder, Diane, how likely you think it is that Donald Trump will actually be able to deliver some kind of peace this year. He has said, his team has said, he wants to achieve peace talks within the first 100 days. Is that realistic in your view, or do you think we're looking at a far longer time frame?
I think it's increasingly realistic, and I'm rooting for him. This has got to end. I mean, this is a horrific loss of life and of opportunity, and I think he might do it.
And do you think Putin is it? I mean, I suppose it so depends on what the terms are, but a lot of the things that have been mooted so far, for example, this idea of a demilitarized zone between Russia and Ukraine that Keith Kellogg talked about. I mean, to me, that appears to be a complete non-starter if you're Vladimir Putin. So do you really think Putin is prepared to strike a deal with Trump at the moment?
I think he'd better be. I think he's facing a deal maker on the other side who is prepared to flood the world with oil and to drive down Putin's income, is prepared to strong-arm China and India into stopping buying it, is prepared to flood Ukraine with weapons if he's snubbed. And I think that these are the pressures building up that will allow. Now, a glimpse is today, the release of an American hostage. See, I'm not such a bad guy, says Vlad. I can be reasonable. And that's a big plus victory for Trump in this two-man contest, that he's willing to give up a hostage and under pressure from Trump. So I see movement, and I think it's a tragedy. It will always be, however it ends. Even pushed back to the 2014 border, it's a tragedy for Ukrainian people and for Ukrainian, and I would say for the world. But I think that something has to happen, and I think it's going to. At least that's my hope.
And the final video that we got is Pete Hegseth's comment on where the US sees the war in Ukraine ending. And this is the most significant video and the most significant political comment that we've had on Ukraine in recent times.
As the war approaches its third anniversary, our message is clear. The bloodshed must stop, and this war must end. He intends to end this war by diplomacy and bringing both Russia and Ukraine to the table. And the U.S. Department of Defense will help achieve this goal. We want, like you, a sovereign and prosperous Ukraine. But we must start by recognizing that returning to Ukraine's pre-2014 borders is an unrealistic objective. Chasing this illusionary goal will only prolong the war and cause more suffering. A durable peace for Ukraine must include robust security guarantees to ensure that the war will not begin again. This must not be Minsk 3.0. That said, the United States does not believe that NATO membership for Ukraine is a realistic outcome of a negotiated settlement. Instead, any security guarantee must be backed by capable European and non-European troops. If these troops are deployed as peacekeepers to Ukraine at any point, they should be deployed as part of a non-NATO mission, and they should not be covered under Article 5. There also must be robust international oversight of the line of contact. To be clear, as part of any security guarantee, there will not be U.S. troops deployed to Ukraine. To further enable effective diplomacy and drive down energy prices that fund the Russian war machine, President Trump is unleashing American energy production and encouraging other nations to do the same. Lower energy prices, coupled with more effective enforcement of energy sanctions, will help bring Russia to the table. Safeguarding European security must be an imperative for European members of NATO. As part of this, Europe must provide the overwhelming share of future lethal and non-lethal aid to Ukraine. Members of this contact group must meet the moment. This means donating more ammunition and equipment, leveraging comparative advantages, expanding your defense industrial base, and importantly, leveling with your citizens about the threat facing Europe. Part of this is speaking frankly with your people about how this threat can only be met by spending more on defense. 2% is not enough. President Trump has called for 5%, and I agree. Increasing your commitment to your own security is a down payment for the future, a down payment, as you said, Mr. Secretary, of peace through strength. The United States faces consequential threats to our homeland. We must and we are focusing on security of our own borders. We also face a peer competitor in the communist Chinese with the capability and intent to threaten our homeland and core national interests in the Indo-Pacific. The U.S. is prioritizing deterring war with China in the Pacific, recognizing the reality of scarcity and making the resourcing trade-offs to ensure deterrence does not fail. We ask each of your countries to step up on fulfilling the commitments that you have made. And we challenge your countries and your citizens to double down and recommit yourselves not only to Ukraine's immediate security needs, but to Europe's long-term defense and deterrence goals. The United States remains committed to the NATO alliance and to the defense partnership with Europe. Full stop. But the United States will no longer tolerate an imbalanced relationship which encourages dependency. Rather, our relationship will prioritize empowering Europe to own responsibility for its own security.
I think saying that Ukraine cannot retain or cannot get back the territory that Russia has captured since this reinvasion 3 years ago, I think is an accurate reflection of what is tactically possible on the ground. I think he's missed the fact that Russia could be destroyed at the operational level, their ability to continue to resource the tactical fight, and that would cause Russia to collapse. But then geopolitically, I think they may not want Russia to collapse because that could cause huge problems across the whole of the Russian Federation. So he may be playing a bigger game here. The one thing that the opening statement has done is it's brought Vladimir Putin to the negotiating table. He's brought out in detail what really was Zelensky's plan for peace, or part of it, when he went to see Donald Trump and his team before the inauguration. And Zelensky had said he'd be willing to give up some of the territory so that it could be brought back into Ukraine diplomatically in the future, and provided he was given security guarantees and NATO membership. Pete Hegseth has ruled out NATO membership. And where I see the big thing is putting a lot of pressure on European countries and non-European NATO countries. And I think here he's pointing to Canada, stepping up and providing security capability to go in and police any peace deal and act as a peacekeeping force in Ukraine. And a lot of pressure on expenditure in Europe on defence. Of course, being NATO members, all NATO members are supposed to spend 2% of their GDP on defence. Many don't. But after the last Trump administration, the number that did grew dramatically. There are still major countries like Germany, like Canada, that don't. And we've got Trump through Hegseth and comments coming out of Mark Rutte, the new Secretary General of NATO, talking of 3% of GDP, and the Americans are saying it should be up to 5% of GDP being spent. I think the underlying piece of all of this is America has been saying to Europe, and is saying to Europe now overtly, you've been freeloading on us for so many years. America's focus is America first, because Pete Hegseth talks about the existential threat that there is to US borders, especially in its southern border. And he's talking about the Chinese influence that there is within the Belt and Road Initiative and the push of refugees up into the United States. And he talks about the threat there is from China, the growing threat in Southeast Asia. And that's where US's national focus is. And of course, we've got three conflicts around the world. We've got Europe with Russia, Ukraine, we've got the Middle East, and we've got Southeast Asia that's potentially going to blow up. US national interest is Southeast Asia first, Middle East second, Europe third. And he's turning around to the EU, to Europe and to NATO and say, don't expect us anymore to deal with all of it. You step up and provide primary focus for the war in Europe. He hasn't said that they will withdraw all US support. And I think what we'll see here is if Europe steps up, the US will continue support in the background, but they want to focus and move their assets elsewhere. They may have huge assets, but they're still limited. And it's, I think, from a personal perspective, wrong for us to expect the US to deal with all three conflicts as the leading nation in doing that. It's quite right in asking European nations of NATO to step up, spend more, spend it more wisely, and take on more responsibility. So that's our recap of events this week. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to put comments below and sign up for Times Radio membership. It'll give you some fantastic exclusive content. I'm Philip Ingram. Thank you for watching.